Toby Clements' Kingmaker series of novels set during the Wars of the Roses bring us into the company of a cast of fictional characters who rub shoulders with the great giants of the wars. And it really is a fabulous adventure story across 4 novels. He's going to talk to us about the search for accuracy and truth in historical fiction, which, you know, that's a very relevant subject this week, given all of the revelations last weekend about the possible fates of the Princes of the Tower. But it's not just when you're writing fiction, it's not just about getting the facts right, it's about inhabiting the lives of characters who lived so long ago. And that's something that I think Toby captures so well. His next book, which is publishing next July, is about Thomas Malory, in fact. So, you know, perhaps one of history's greatest weavers of tales. So Toby, I'm very, very happy to welcome you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for that and for Annie's very kind introduction. It's a bit unusual. I don't do these talks at all often, but because of COVID and that kind of thing. So forgive the slight squeaky voice. I will settle down into it in a minute. But thank you very much for having me here in Grange Court and the Morton History Society. Very, very kind of you to have me. What I would like to talk about, as Annie says, is it's the research I did for my books. And it's been a slight journey from so that's the book. That's book 4, and that's me wearing the same jacket, sadly. So this represents my slightly strange, twisted, and almost inexplicable journey from, stay here, from childhood, when I first picked up Warwick the Kingmaker, the fabulous Ladybird book, when I was about 8 and read it till it fell apart, to that. Now, I don't know if anyone knows what that is. Does anybody recognize what that is? That's very good for me, because I didn't know what it is, but that's where it ended up. And I think possibly it says more about me than it should. Maybe that's not true. But so if I say I went to school round the corner in Breedenbury, and every sort of holy day of obligation, we would go off to some usually quite boring place. But one day we went to Tewkesbury, and being kind of little warlike children, we had such a good time, and we were absolutely mesmerized. We had to do a project on the whole, you know, on the battle, and we became absolute expert archers and this, that, and the other. And it really stuck in my mind as being the kind of the thing I most loved. But that was it. And then, you know, I moved on and I discovered other things, and so I then became, but I always wanted to be a writer. I realized I wanted to be a writer, but I'm not an academic historian or anything like that. And I carried on, and I worked in, I'll tell you a bit about myself. I worked in a bookshop, and then I reviewed books for newspapers, and then, but I always wanted to write. So when I then started, I wrote a few sort of joke books. I don't know if any of you have read the marvelous Asti Spumanti Code, but I think it is still in print. May not be. And it was fine, but I always wanted to go back to writing about history, particularly about the Wars of the Roses, which I thought I knew a lot about. But then I learned so I thought, right, I'll write a historical novel. And I sat down and I realized I knew literally nothing. That's more or less the sum of it. And my 9 or 10-year-old project of Tewkesbury Abbey about the battle. So I had to learn about writing historical fiction, which imposes some quite strange disciplines upon the reader and the writer. The reader requires certain satisfactions of historical fiction, I think, but the writer has to meet it to be successful. And I had quite an ambitious idea of what I wanted it to be like. I wanted it to be, I started off with loving all the Earls, the Mortimers, the Warwick, the Kingmaker. He was just so cool. and the idea of being a knight with just gadgets, you know, poleaxes and stuff like that, so cool. But then as I grew older, I found myself much more interested in the kind of, I think basically I became a socialist and wanted to know about how just ordinary people, people who didn't spend their lives fighting, weren't paid to fight, and who just would try and get by. And it became sort of an obsession. And so I had to, instead of reading of all the facts, I mean, I read all the brilliant histories of the Alison Weir and is it Trevor Royal, I think, and all those, and I read all those, and it gave you an idea of the facts of what happened, which year and stuff like that. But I really wanted to know what it'd be like, what's the granular detail, the nitty gritty. And one of the things I held in mind is what the shoe leather would have been like to have been anywhere in one of those, you know, at the time, how close to the ground, what would it have felt like under your foot? And so I started, let's see, this. Does anyone know what this is? Gave that away, but it's the armour door at Tewkesbury Abbey. It's a sacristy door, and if you look closely, which you can't do because you're sitting down, but they used plate armour from the battle to reinforce it. They just collected it off the field, and that I remember so specifically being absolutely amazed, and sort of the recycling and the ingenuity and the craftiness of them to do all that sort of stuff. And so that sort of took me away from the lords and the nobles and not there's anything wrong. And I started then to try and imagine what their world would have been like. And it's an imaginative feat, really, that you have to you sort of these are books of ours they're mostly European, and they do, I mean, Burgundian, I mean, and they show life both sides. I mean, this is obviously a hunting scene, and it's quite well to do, but then they show barrels and what it must be like to be so cold. And I wanted to capture that sort of aspect of it. I don't know why, but I just loved the harshness of it and the absences they had, and try to reimagine their minds, the 15th century mind. And it was all really, I discovered about absences, what you don't have. And they had so few things. It's utterly amazing. And you know, it's like they would take even the well-to-do Earl Warwick traveled with his bed and his windows, didn't he? You know, because there was just nothing. And if you go to these places, you realize that they had to be so resourceful. You know, if you found metal on the battlefield, you would have to use it. I mean, it makes perfect sense. So this was my kind of aim, that I was trying to get that across. But I had to. This is basically what I'm trying to point out here, is that this is book learning, which I really love. You know, it's strange maps of, this is Calais, and the cleverness where they had a sluice which they could close and flood the land to prevent it. This is Pontoise, and I borrowed ideas from modern interpretations. This is York, which I actually have never been to, but does it look at all familiar? And this is someone's idea of what a small castle would have looked like, which I found really useful to sort of populate, to allow my characters to have something to put their hands against and lean against and know what they're. And then once I sort of gathered the facts. And historical fiction isn't just about the facts. It has to be. It's about the gaps between the facts. What we know is pure history, and those are brilliant books. But it's to make that sort of thing come alive and to fill in the gaps. And that's where, as a historical fiction writer, that's where your opportunity lies to make up lies, I suppose, is the thing. And this is the sort of thing I most love. This is Simon Benning. It's to be honest, it's 100 years later after it's in 1550 or something like that. But the things I loved about it were, like when they went to church. I'm going to leave briefly. Let's point out that they left their little sticks against the wall. And I just thought the idea of everyone carrying a stick wherever they went was just such a charming thing. And that's the sort of inspiring little detail that I always kept in mind while I was writing while I was writing those 4 novels. And this again is such a contrast in between courtly behavior and guys just in the fields doing nice, well, having a terrible time probably. And I found these things really useful, and really I became almost obsessed with them. Planes, I don't know, it's strange, and because I suppose because I'm a middle-aged man, I'm becoming interested in wood planes myself and things like that. And I loved how cold it was. Oh, that's the same one again. How cold it was, all in my imagination, and I had to keep this sort of that was the atmosphere I was going for, and everything sort of seemed to reinforce that, and how strange they were. You know, that I literally, I mean, this might be a pilgrimage or something like that, but they're so peculiar and unusual to me, and I became obsessed with those sort of weird little details. But there were, but there's a great sense of humour. So that this guy's put on his armour to bell the cat, which is, ingenious. Of course you would, because you don't want to be scratched. And so what have you got? You've got, I'll put my armour on. And I just loved all that sort of thing, and the glasses, all these little details that come. I mean, I'm just showing these random slides. My son, unfortunately, upgraded my computer and lost all my other slides. So these are just totally random, but I just kept in mind while I was tootling along doing my thing. And there's a character in my book called Sir John something, and this, I'm imagining him with a beard and his glasses, and how the thick, murky lenses, and just how awful it must have been. And yet they had fun. But then I also wanted to know, it's not enough what they did. It was and I wanted to know how they dressed, and that how long would it take to put on a headdress? I mean, that's 15 separate active twists. I don't know, actually after a while you could probably do that quite quickly, but still, it was all that kind of stuff. It was just, I really wanted to know the day-to-day stuff. And then, so once I got all this sort of book learning and the events, I then went to various places. I spent a lot of time on my bicycle, cycling, just to get the idea of distance, really. This is the Weald Down Museum. I don't know if you've ever been there. This is Bayleaf Cottage, or Bayleaf House, which was the model of in my books. They live in a cottage in this house. From having nothing, they end up there through a series of kind of quite skillful maneuvers and luck. And this is how I always imagined them living, but just unannounced, in the middle of nowhere, just a house that they had built with, and they'd made it themselves. And this is Bruges, I think. But again, I've got the snow back in. It's always snowing in my books. That's the other thing. And I really loved all that aspect of it. And this is the inside. I think this is overcrowded. This is inside of Bayleaf House. But and I think this is like a really well-appointed kitchen with this must, well, there's 10 or 20 people, 10, 15 people, and it's really well appointed. Yeah, and this is bed, sliding truckle bed. This I think is probably Elizabethan, so that much later. But that would have been the height of luxury, and they had to have the 4-poster beds where they all slept together because it was just warmer that way. And they had they pulled the curtains around it because of the drafts, and they took those sorts of things with them wherever they went. And that's if you were really well to do. If lots of the kind of archers just slept on the floor and were really, really hardy and tough. And I really wanted to get into all that sort of stuff and really portray that. That's the fireplace. I don't know if it's just, I became obsessed with curfews, and there's these kind of aspects of smoke control. I became obsessed with domestic architecture, and it all sort of feeds into the atmosphere of the books, which I was trying to get, again, back to the shoe leather, This costrels, I saw a costrel and I mentioned it, I think, in every book because I knew what it was, and that's one. And it's a leather bottle, which you might think is disposable, but it would have been. They loved them so much, and they kept hold of them, and they were so valuable. And then I had these occupations. I think she's a bit later as well, but it was really nice to see women doing represented and actually working as an artistic endeavor, which is instead of weaving, the carding and stuff like that. And then just the little details. I really wanted to get that. This is someone broadcasting the scene, and this goes on today. This is a modern someone who harvests and weaves rushes in exactly the same way as probably there's a scene in my book when they escape on one of these boats, and it's probably entirely unchanged for 500 years, and I keep saying I became obsessed with that, but that was one of the things I wanted to show what the sort of unfancied parts of life was like for things that don't get recorded, that no one bothers to write down because it's everyday sort of nonsense. But I love their sense of humor. I think this is an owl doctor inspecting a glass of urine. And it could be anything, couldn't it? But I just really love their sort of weird ingenuity, their senses of humor. And I had to keep these sorts of things in mind as I was rolling along, and not get too serious about it. I think there are lots of historical fiction. It's quite serious. I mean, because it's usually quite dramatic events, and you don't really. Well, I wanted sort of lighter moments of sort of day-to-day satisfaction. So I described things like the harvests and having a bath was one of the things which I was really interested by. Because you take away things from them and you realize how little they've got. So you've got to come at it from the other way, like from behind, how they would have arrived at something novel, like having a bath, putting your hands in warm water would have been really quite odd, because why would you ever? The water would come from the pot when you were making your endless pottage, and that would be it. So you would never really touch hot water, which I just thought was so strange. And then the business with the button. My two characters are Gilbertine, as a Gilbertine nun and a Gilbertine monk, and they didn't have buttons or buttonholes. Because they just didn't. And then suddenly you're confronted with one and you think, what on earth is it? And stuff like that. And they didn't have pockets, which is just, you think, why wouldn't you have pockets? And they didn't stitch the legs of the trousers together. And you think, why not? Why wouldn't you do that? It seems so obvious. And yet it wasn't. And you see them, I'll come on to doing the reenactment stuff. And you see them getting dressed, and it's the weirdest thing for a man to get dressed. Basically, he had to put on his things, lace them up between his legs with his codpiece loose, and then bend over and get someone to tie them with his points to his paw point. So he put on his shirt, put on his braids, his pants, and then pull up these woolen things with a stitched or loosely connected down the middle, and then bend over, and someone would tie the trousers, the hose, to the waistcoat. You think, what about a belt? And it's so because they had sword belts, so why wouldn't they have? It's just so strange and so kind of wonderful in a way, to have such sort of ordinary little puzzles. What is that? Why didn't we do it like that? And I loved all that sort of these, and I became obsessed with pigs and Martin Mass when they used to slaughter their pigs for the winter, and it comes into every book. I can't explain why. So then that once I'd sort of got that idea, then I had to sort of do this traveling, and I cycled up to Middleham Castle and I took a picture of the pub, which I think is brilliant, this black sheep, and I cycled around lots of places. Weirdly, I didn't come to Mortimer's Cross, because everything's changed so much that and as a historical fiction writer, I don't think you can't get to the absolute truth. You know, you have to, your truth has to be good enough or persuasive enough. And so there were certain places I didn't go to. I didn't go to York, as I said. I'm not sure I should have done. But you can only do it so far, because otherwise you do get, you know, bogged down. And I know I did get bogged down with pigs and that kind of nonsense. But it was, you have to, each detail has to sort of win its place in the book. And you have to try and do it, sort of have a really salient detail. I don't know if you're fans of Hilary Mantel, but her genius is to find a single detail. So I was reading the other day, Thomas Cromwell's walking along and he spots through a door 2 peacocks hanging by their feet, weighted down to bleed into buckets. And you just think, my God, that's just, you would, wouldn't you? You would see that, but you know, it's those sorts of details that you're constantly searching for. I found when I was that's what I really wanted, and so that's why I was getting down into talking about pigs and shading them for Martin. So I didn't go to Parhelion, which I understand is not there now. Well, it could have been this morning. And this was another particular image. Again, snow. But that's Towson, which was the sort of the end point of my first book that I really wanted to get to. When I wrote it, I didn't think it would be a 2-book series. They all got killed in the end. But it's not a plot spoiler, because then my editor said, you just can't kill them. And okay. So they lived for another 3 novels, some of them. But Towson was the sort of the big thing that I hadn't. For quite interesting reasons, we don't talk about it as a battle. You know, it was washed from the public memory. And there is a Towton Battle Society, but they meet in a caravan. There are about 4 of them, and it's like nothing like Tewkesbury or Bosworth or anything like that. But it was the thing. I just thought it was the most extraordinarily awful thing. Something like 3% of the English population was there that day, and they killed like 20,000 people, more than the first day in the Somme. You know, you think it's just amazing. And they were, you know, their generation before been fighting in France, shoulder to shoulder. So it's very, very interesting for me. That was the big thing. That was the kind of the end beacon that I was working my way to, and all the other little the Morton's Cross was a beacon on the way, but it was getting my characters from one to the other plausibly and entertainingly. So this is why I had to do all this stuff. Now, my characters started out, and I had no idea. This is really the meat of the thing, is how peculiar the journey has been for me from Warwick Kingmaker, the book, to those instruments, which I will get back to. And I started off with, I didn't know who they would be, but I wanted them. And then I discovered the Gilbertines. I don't know if you've heard of the Gilbertines. This is a Victorian idea of what they might have looked like, but they were the only purely English order of clerics. And they started off as just nuns. And their priory was completely sealed, and they had a gap in their wall that was no fatter than a thumb and no longer than a finger, through which they were allowed to look out. It was brass bound, so they couldn't enlarge it if they wanted. Most of the women in there were there voluntary to, you know, just to get away from the cold, but it wouldn't have helped. But there's a strange thing about them that Gilbert of Sempringham, they set up in Lincolnshire. He said, well, we also have monks, which it doesn't sound like a very good idea. But they were in one priory and with a big wall down the middle, and the wall went through the middle of their church. And they used to so that they would never see the priest. They would hear the priest talking about, saying mass, and then he would pass the communion wafer through like a little, like the old British Railway ticket things, and it would just turn, and there would be the wafers. It's so strange. And of course, inevitably, trouble because you had the monks and the nuns. Well, anyway, trouble started, and that's where I started, and I based them in the fens of Lincolnshire, where they actually spent most of their time running ferry services, the men, and dredging canals, dredging the fens. So they were odd. But I had no idea that they had existed, and so it was that by that stage I had a sort of start, and they set off, and then I was inspired by certain sort of specific things. I went to one of those reenactment things, and I saw a poleaxe. I don't know if any of you have actually ever seen these things here. And they're truly chilling. It's as if you could imagine the nastiest person you've ever met trying to think up the nastiest thing they could think up. And that is more or less what they would come up with. It's so horrible that just the sort of like, and I was chilled, genuinely chilled to be in its presence. It's like when I, going to, and it was really horrible, but it really stuck in my mind. And then the whole book hinges on what I call the ledger, which was taken from the cathedral at Rouen. And it all hinges on Edward IV's birth. And this is how I imagine this is just sort of someone's, like a keepsake, like a diary, and they just put in all these lovely little drawings and stuff like that. And so that inspired one of the plot points. But then that's what I've been avoiding while talking about all the pigs and stuff, is that they were always fighting, and these are, I think, theft books, German theft books, and you realise just how strange the whole thing was, and that just the technique. I mean, who thought of that? They didn't think of belts, but they thought of how to use swords wrongly and trip each other up. So weird. But of course the battles are the big thing that keeps thins the numbers out, actually. But it's obviously they're the most dramatic. But I did have a particular thing about the battles. I just couldn't imagine that very many people really knew what was going on, because the nobility are encased in armour, and even though they're trained for it, their view and their hearing would have been very restrained, and the common men, which is what my character Thomas is. He's an archer, but he becomes an archer. He would have just had no idea what was going on. You're in the dark, not the dark, but in the snow and in the mist at Barnet. They just would have been so bamboozled by the whole thing, and yet they managed to kill each other quite efficiently. So I was just, well, I don't know. That was the thing that I had to put in, and then so this is just armour. I mean, it is amazing stuff. But this is my friend Tim, who really, from whom I got a lot of my day-to-day stuff. He is like a really dedicated reenactor. He doesn't look very fierce there. He's an accountant, but he is really, it's just his love of the real detail. I hope I've got that picture. Oh yes, you're about to see my tummy. Okay, so just there, but it's just really interesting. So he spends all his time. He's even got the stance right. My stance is pure Hollywood, but that arrow went miles, whereas his is much more. That's how they shot, and he's always so dedicated, and he's so interesting. He's an absolute font of knowledge. And I really, really loved my time sort of hanging around with him and his really strange friends. And they have kind of a list of events they go to, and some are really good, and some, as he says, it's just a beer and a bash. And it's just. But this, so I tried to use all this stuff, so I knew what I'd be talking about when I did it. And these bows are, I don't know if it's interesting, but they are 48-pound draw weights or something like that, and the real one, the ones they would have used were 3 times that, and were really. I mean, I saw they'd got recreations from Mary Rose and things like that, and they were just like basically logs. And how they bent them, I just don't know. But it was all sorts of. There's a lovely thing about how you knock one of those bows. You step into it and you have to bend it around your body. All that kind of stuff, which I picked up from my, from spending time with Tim, the accountant, and his friends. What are we going on to now? Oh, no. I'm not being funny. In an effort to get to sorry, fantastic. In an effort to get to this is verisimilitude. Do I mean that? I don't know. To get a really I wanted it to be so that everyone, because and people have said, oh, it's just like being in a film, but of course it is just like being in a film because that was how I interpreted everything that I'd seen. And I wanted it to be just like that, so that you really felt, so you could see every detail. And again, back to the shoe leather, I really wanted that. And this is, so obviously there was lots of, they had some very strange ideas about medicine, which I think all women in historical fiction, they always have to have some magical secret gift. And my heroine, Catherine, it becomes she's a brilliant surgeon, it turns out. And I know that it's I wouldn't have done it that way otherwise, but it did lead me into some really, really strange avenues of inquiry. And this is where it becomes inexplicably weird. And these wounded men, this is a wounded man. He's showing 6 wounds that you can get, and it's. Yes. I did no research into piety. I was not at all interested. But I don't know if it does make a good book. It makes a very, very good book. But it wasn't really for me, and I wanted, because my characters they weren't pious, and I didn't like horses. Well, I do like horses, but I don't know enough about them. And I went to school around the corner, and the headmistress there loved horses, and I've always been envious of them because they get so much more care than we did. So I always like horses, and I don't like bird shows, so I didn't do anything. There's no hunting at all, and I totally recognise that heraldry and the livery badges and stuff like that are very useful, particularly in battle, really vital. But it makes my teeth, furrow over with anger when people talk about it. So I didn't do any of that. So it falls a bit short in that thing. But now we are actually. I'm coming now to the last bit of what is where this strange journey took me. And I don't know if any of you actually read that book, the first book. There's a particular operation in there which I glimpsed that lots of knightly people who wore armour and rode horses they were often afflicted by a particular thank you for nodding, yeah. But a particular thing, and so this is just some terrible thing that someone was doing to someone else. But what these are actually is they're instruments that were designed by in the 14th century by John Ardern, who was an English surgeon, might have been 15. And what in this thing that I glimpsed. It was lots of men were hospitalized by this particular, the fistula. And what it is, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I wrote about this at all. And I'm really sorry to have to bring it up again because it's a pylenoidal cyst. And I really do not recommend any of you Google it with image search or anything like that. But what it is, it's the Americans had a lot in Vietnam and they called it G-pass. And what it is, if you're hot and sweaty and you're bouncing up and down on a horse or in a jeep, there's a condition, and it actually all it is an ingrowing hair, and it grows into your skin and becomes infected and is extremely nasty, and it hospitalized thousands of Americans in the Second World War, and they all had to lie on their fronts, and it probably does seem quite an easy operation by the sound of it, but John O'Dern, for some reason, thought that it was a fistula, so that well, I'm going to show you the picture, okay? I put that in as a sort of joke, but it's so this was his operation. I don't know if you can see exactly what's going on, but perhaps I'm not going to enlarge it, but it's so that's what it was, and I'll turn it back because it is really gross. And but John O'Dern made the equivalent of millions from this operation, because it was only afflicted people who wore heavy armour and had horses and saddles and stuff like that, and everybody had it. And so he was quite an interesting character. He also he was a big proponent of opium, and dwales was what he called them, of anesthetics. But he did make lots of money putting this spoon basically up above of the victim, and then cutting a kind of a tube between the ingrowing hair. And that's really, that was once I got to there, I thought I should not learn anymore. And so that's where we got, and so that was book one. I'm not now going to tell you about book 3 or 4, but I'd realized that I perhaps knew enough and shouldn't do any more. I did some more. This medieval surgery was really interesting. I did the corneal, what was it, when you get the misty eyes with age, and there's an operation, cataracts, yeah. I did there was an operation for that, which was they call it couching for cataracts, and I think it lasted for about a week of good vision, and by which time the eye doctor had moved on, and then followed by permanent blindness. So that was one of those, but that was really it. I waffled a bit and got distracted, but that was my sort of journey from Warwick the Kingmaker to these funny little these awful operations, and I don't know why I had my character Catherine conduct this. It's just so strange, but there we are, and that's really it. I'm afraid. Have I been too short, too long? Well, thank you very much. When
I first read that book, I thought, really? Yeah.
Sorry,
we need to. I'm going to, if you please ask your question, I will repeat the question for the sake of people who are on the Zoom. So, do we have any questions for Toby? Surely you want to ask about people's bottoms. Yeah.
It's interesting that you had come to historical fiction from the commercial side, in other words, having sold and reviewed books.
Yes.
And talking about the conflict between the academic historic approach and the fictional approach.
Yeah.
And then you said something about, one or two things like women in fiction in historical fiction had to have some magical power. Are there any other pearls of wisdom of that kind that you could say that you think good?
Well, I would defer.
Pearls of wisdom for historical fiction.
Yeah. I do think it is difficult writing about women. Why I'm talking about this when their experts are here, but they're quite often, I've noticed that lots of women have to sit at home and wait for letters, and that's what I really loved about your book, was that Cecily was so involved. I mean, there were battles which she couldn't get involved in, but the politics was so. She was just there, and I think it is very, very difficult. And also the cross-dressing, that was not your, but my Catherine has to disguise herself to pass through and no one spots her. Anyway, it's actually quite a good book, but there are some, moments where you have to suspend your disbelief. But I think that's why. I loved sort of storytelling when I was a kid, and that was the thing. I wanted to tell stories and not be constrained by. I wanted all my facts all the made up stuff to be plausible. So you have to slightly squint to believe that she would be able to pass as a boy, and had a magical ability to operate on fistulae. Not sure. I don't want to know what the plural is. And so, but I don't know about. I think that the real experts on the pearls of wisdom about women in historical fiction are here and not here. Yeah. Does that answer that question? Not really. I could go on, but I.
Other questions?
There's a couple online which
Oh, yes, do.
come near the mic to read. So the first one might be for your friend Tim actually, but or you. It's a question saying, have reenactors now adjusted to the fact that we now know that medieval people had proper underwear, actual bras and knickers or pants that tied at the waist, as with discoveries in Austria?
Again, another area which I'm not expert. Yes, I bet they probably have. They love all that kind of stuff. I really.
So yes, we do.
You do. I'm some of the nicest people I've met, the reenactors, and they're always the happiest. They're just. I was amazed. I was sort of just smiling at them, saying, "Don't talk to me. Just leave me alone."
As you mentioned earlier, the brace, that's male underwear.
Yes. Yeah. That's it. They do it. Pants exist.
The other one, you've shown us quite a few lovely examples already, but do you have a favourite illustration or document you found in your research?
Ooh. I think that the one I most is the it's so cool. This book. I really love the book, and I can't even remember where I found it. I don't know whether when you're doing. I just didn't take any notes about where my sources were or what they are or anything like that. I just because it was sort of. But the Paston letters, I really loved them, and I loved they were really fantastic. Possibly the Paston letters were the most interesting, and the way they were always whinging, and they were all called John. And this is just there are too many Johns. Four in a row. Great. I mean, but apart from that, it was great.
Any final questions?
Would you say your process is more reading and looking a lot and absorbing, or do you make a lot of notes?
Absorbing, definitely. And then the really annoying thing is that that old thing of Picasso about let inspiration strike me while I'm at my desk. Inspiration usually strikes me when I'm washing up or something like that, and like a plot point is fixed, so and then you have to rush out and write it down. But it's not a kind of, I don't build up a load of notes and then work the story out through that. It is a lot of it is as I go on, and it's sort of once I'd sort of created the world in my mind, then you have the events, and then you just have to weave your way through, and so the notes are, I don't know, if I'm honest. I should possibly. Do you take lots of notes?
I do, but I think what the point that you make is so interesting, because the notes are really all about the facts, the histories, the complicated conundrums that you have to solve. But it's the thing that you can't take notes about. It's just the feeling of the living in that environment. The feeling of weight, the weight of the armour on your body, or the length of the dress that you've got to be constantly kicking out of your way, because it's you're not going to get that from books.
No,
you're not going to get it by making notes.
But you do get that from reenacting, don't you? It's really must. The other really lovely thing I got from reenacting, I was talking to. She's a French woman, and she sold swords, and she said, "You never see a man pick up a sword and not smile." It's so weird. You think, what? And then I was going, oh yeah, so strange. Isn't it? All those funny little things you just don't realise. Do you sort of camp out and things like
Oh,
that?
yeah. I stay in castles and I will fight as man as well.
Oh, there we are.
Just get that cross-dressing, you
Yeah,
can.
yes, yeah.
Just one more online in that time. Kim's asked, how did your dislike of piety affect your depiction of a nun and a monk?
Well, they escaped as soon as they could. They were, it's, yeah, that's what they did. They escaped, and it would have just been so intrusive to the plot. You know, they were always saying mass and all that kind of stuff. And I know if it's a novel of ideas, then it, you know, then it's kind of easier. But if it's, mine is an adventure story, so it would not. Today I went to mass, and then I was there, and then on Wednesday I went to mass, and I couldn't eat fish, I couldn't eat meat or anything. So piety out the window, along with those sort of things, which I acknowledge. You know, it's just not. It's not for me. Doesn't sound very good, actually, does it?
I remember once I was doing a historical fiction writer, and he said, have you noticed there's never any descriptions of clothes in my books? And I thought, yeah, he's right, there are none. Yes, yeah, right. He said, don't care. Not interested, don't care.
The other thing, the pearl of wisdom that my first editor told me is get them to Germany. I don't know why. But there's a big German book market. They love historical fiction, so get them to Germany. That is a pearl of wisdom. I haven't managed that, and my books have sold a bit in Germany. Got terrible reviews, you know, like 1 star on Amazon. But you know, that's.
Toby Clements.
Well, thank you very much for bearing with me.